Welcome back to artofdino.com. It's been a while since I made some videos. I'm going to pick it back up again and try to fire up a lot of interesting things in the coming time. So let's do this. But here we go. I wanted to discuss one finding that I found in some old books from the 1770s. This Pennsylvania kind of review that had different articles, seems like a weekly kind of occurrence. And I found some cool articles in there, a bunch of random kind of things. And this one was from someone's one's travels to Sicily and Malta, I believe. And he talks about some ancient forests, ancient trees, some volcanic activity, a lot of different things that I thought were pretty relevant to what we all talk about in this community. And I think it had some cool insight. And just, I love hearing about ancient trees and what their true size and how big they were, because everywhere we go, we see just baby trees, barely anything. These trees are so young. It just seems like someone at one point dumped a bunch of soil everywhere, or some kind of soot settled everywhere, and then something grew. But the true size and purpose and nature of all of these ancient trees is still under debate, and no one really knows because we have so few ancient trees left. And I'll show some pictures later, but how big were they? Devil's Tower, was that a tree? Was that a mushroom, I'm beginning to even think? Or something else even totally different? Meru, is that the center of our world? Is there a tree? Yggdrasil, all the other kind of ancient trees. How big really were they? You see Avatar, all these other movies, all these different things, people driving through them, people living in them, people doing so many different kinds of things with trees. And this account that I found has a lot of cool insight that I'd never heard before. And so I think you all are definitely going to like it, because some of these things are just huge, and the way they grew, and it just really points a picture to a past where these things were everywhere, and that was the size of trees, or they were at one point growing. All these ancient trees were seeds at one point. What was happening then? Were they planted by humans? Were they spread through ash or through whatever? There's a very cool kind of take on the volcanoes in this passage that I'm going to read. I'm only going to read a couple pages, but it is packed. And this is the magazine, the Pennsylvania Magazine, or American Monthly Museum. I found a lot of good things in here, so there will be some future videos on this. And this is the section, further extracts from Mr. Bridone's travels through Sicily and Malta. I'm going to read the pages that I feel relevant, and let me know what you think. Here we go. I'm starting at the top of page 81, where it says, the beginning of the second region. Till we arrived at the beginning of the second region, called by the natives La Regione Silvosa, or the woody region, because it is composed of one vast forest that extends all around the mountain. Part of this was destroyed by a very singular event not later than the year I755. During an eruption of the volcano, an immense torrent of boiling water issued, as is imagined, from the great crater of the mountain, and in an instant poured down to its base, overwhelming and ruining everything it met within its course. Our conductors showed us the traces of this torrent, which are still very visible, but are now beginning to recover verdure and vegetation, which for some time appeared to have been lost. The track it has left seems to be about 1.5 miles broad, and in some places still more. The common opinion I find is that this water was raised by the power of suction through some communication between the volcano and the sea, the absurdity of which is too glaring to need a refutation. The power of suction alone, even supposing a perfect vacuum, could never raise water to more than 33 or 34 feet, which is equal to the weight of a column of air the whole height of the atmosphere. But this circumstance, I should imagine, might be easily enough accounted for, either by a stream of lava falling suddenly into one of the valleys of snow that occupy the higher regions of the mountains, and melting it down, or what I think is still more probable, that the melted snow, finding vast caverns and reservoirs in the mountain, where it is lodged for some time, till the excessive heat of the lava below bursts the sides of these caverns, produces this phenomenon, which has been matter of great speculation to the Sicilian philosophers, and has employed the pens of several of them. The same thing happened in an eruption of Vesuvius last century, and in an instant swept away about 500 people who were marching in procession at the foot of the mountain to implore the mediation of Saint Januarius. So again, the volcanoes and the ancient trees. These are two topics that I just think are mind-blowingly open to a new type of discussion. And so it's always interesting to find what the old people thought. And so this is where the section that really starts talking about the trees, and then it goes back into volcanoes. Near to this place, we passed through some beautiful woods of cork and evergreen oak, growing absolutely out of the lava, the soil having as yet hardly filled the crevices of that porous substance, and not a great way farther I observed several little mountains that seemed to have been formed by a late eruption. I dismounted from my mule and climbed to the top of them all. There are 7 in number, every one of them with a regular cup or crater on the top, and in some the great gulf, or as they call it, voragine, that had discharged the burnt matter of which these little mountains are formed, is still open. I tumbled stones down into these gulfs and heard the noise for a long time after. All the fields round to a considerable distance are covered with large burnt stones discharged from these little volcanoes, or vents, or something. From this place it is not less than 5 or 6 miles to the great chestnut trees, through forests growing out of the lava, in several places almost impassable. Of these trees there are many of an enormous size, but the Castagno de Centocavalli is by much the most celebrated. I have even found it marked in an old map of Sicily, published near 100 years ago, and in all the maps of Etna and its environs it makes a very conspicuous figure. I own I was by no means struck with its appearance, as it does not seem to be one tree, but a bunch of 5 large trees growing together. We complained to our guides of the imposition, when they unanimously assured us that by the universal tradition and even testimony of the country, all these were once united in one stem, that their grandfathers remembered this, when it was looked upon as the glory of the forest and visited from all quarters, that for many years past it had been reduced to the venerable ruin we beheld. We began to examine it with more attention, and found that there was indeed an appearance as if these 5 trees had really been once united in one. The opening in the middle is indeed prodigious, and it does indeed require faith to believe that so vast a space was once occupied by solid timber. But there is no appearance of bark on the inside of any of the stumps, nor on the sides that are opposite to one another. Mr. Glover and I measured it separately and brought it exactly to the same size, 204 feet round. If this was once united in one solid stem, it must with justice indeed have been looked upon as a very wonderful phenomenon in the vegetable world, and was deservedly styled the glory of the forest. And this is in the 1700s, the i700s. So how old were these trees, and how many of them were there? How much were they covering the earth? I bet. I have since been told by the Canonico Rucupero, an ingenious ecclesiastic of this place, that he was at the expense of carrying up peasants with tools to dig round the Castagno de Centocavalli, and he assures me, upon his honor, that he found all these stems united below ground in one root. I allege that so extraordinary an object must have been mentioned by many of their writers. He told me that it had produced several examples, Fallotio, Carrero, and some others. Carrera begs to be excused from telling its dimensions, but says he is sure there was wood enough in that one tree to build a large palace. Their poet, Bagolini, too, has celebrated a tree of the same kind, perhaps the same tree, and Massa, one of their most esteemed authors, says he has seen solid oaks upwards of 40 feet round, but adds that the size of the chestnut trees was beyond belief, the hollow of one of which he says contained 300 sheep, and 30 people on horseback had often been in it at one time. I shall not pretend to say that this is the same tree he means, or whether it ever was one tree or not. There are many others that are well deserving the curiosity of travelers. One of these, about 1.5 miles higher on the mountain, is called Castano del Gallia. It rises from one solid stem to a considerable height, after which it branches out. I measured it about 2 feet from the ground, and found it 76 feet round. There is a third, called Il Castagno del Nave, that is pretty nearly of the same size. All these grow on a thick, rich soil formed originally, I believe, of ashes thrown out by the mountains. So is that some kind of crazy seed soil type of surfacing? So how to constantly create fertile soil by blasting out these things? And what are these vents? How old are these vents? If everything was once an architect and a creation and an engineered masterpiece, this earth, this planet, this world, not planet, but world that we live on, realm, then there's no telling what any of these things were. Here we go. The climate here is much more temperate than in the first region of Etna, where the excessive heats must ever present a very luxuriant vegetation. I find the barometer had fallen to blah blah blah, which announces about 4,000 feet, blah blah blah. The vast quantity of niter contained in the ashes of Etna probably contributes greatly to increase the luxuriance of this vegetation. In the air, too, strongly impregnated with it from the smoke of the volcano, must create a constant supply of this salt, termed by some, not without reason, the food of vegetables, which I find very interesting. The food of vegetables, what comes out of the volcanoes and out of the mountains. There is the ruins of a house in the inside of the great chestnut tree, which had been built for holding the fruit it bears, which is still considerable. Here we dined with excellent appetite, and being convinced that it was in vain to attempt getting to the top of the mountain on that side, we began to descend, and after a very fatiguing journey over old lavas, now become fertile lands and rich vineyards, we arrived about sunset at Jassi Real, where with no small difficulty we at last got lodging in a convent of Dominicans. The last lava we crossed before our arrival there is of a vast extent. I thought we should never have done with it. It certainly is not less than 6 or 7 miles broad, and appears in many places to be of an enormous depth. When we came near the sea, I was desirous to see what form it had assumed in meeting with the water. I went to examine it, and found it had driven back the waves for upwards of a mile, and had formed a large black high promontory, where before it was deep water. This lava I imagined from its barrenness, for it is as yet covered with a very scanty soil, had run from the mountain only a few ages ago, but was surprised to be informed by Signor Recupero, the historiographer of Etna, that this very lava is mentioned by Diodorus Siculus to have burst from Etna in the time of the Second Punic War, when Syracuse was besieged by the Romans. Interesting. Wars, lava, destruction, inner earth, hollow earth. Interesting. I'm not sure. You never know. Rewrites of history. Everything can change. A detachment was sent from Tauromenium to the relief of the besieged. They were stopped on their march by this stream of lava, which, having reached the sea before their arrival at the foot of the mountain, had cut off their passage, and obliged them to return by the back of Etna upwards of 100 miles. His authority for this, he tells me, was taken from inscriptions on Roman monuments found on this lava, and that it was likewise well ascertained by many of the old Sicilian authors. Now, as this is about 2,000 years ago, one would have imagined, if lavas have a regular progress in becoming fertile fields, that this must long ago have become at least arable. This, however, is not the case, and it is as yet only covered with a very scanty vegetation, and incapable of producing either corn or vines. There are indeed pretty large trees growing in the crevices, which are full of a rich earth, but in all probability it will be some 100 years yet before there is enough of it to render this land of any use and to the proprietors. Any use to the proprietors. That's us, I guess, all. But imagine thinking that. What about this? I've just got a glimpse of this being a technology. What if this was an ancient hollow earth technology, or some form of just technology of the layers of earth, underground, whatever, how many layers there could be. I have no idea what the shape is. But if this was just a way of terraforming from underneath the next level, you form all these different kinds of things, and you blast up all this fertile soil and fertile seeds and vegetation of the earth, food of vegetables all over the place, so that it definitely gradually grows, and then you blast your way up through the next thing. I could see this world being many different layers of things, as the ancients have thought. So who knows, just more ideas popping to mind, because I am not happy with what they tell us. And there's got to be stuff behind the scenes that we can figure this out with our thought and imagination. But who knows? It is curious to consider that the surface of this black and barren matter in process of time becomes one of the most fertile soils upon earth. But what must be the time to bring it to its utmost perfection, when after 2,000 years it is still in most places but a barren rock? Its progress is possibly as follows. The lava, being a very porous substance, easily catches the dust that it carries about by the wind, which at first I observe yields only a kind of moss. This rotting, and by degrees increasing the soil, some small meager vegetables are next produced, which, rotting in their turn, are likewise converted into soil. But this progress, I suppose, is often greatly accelerated by showers of ashes from the mountains, as I have observed in some places the richest soil to the depths of 5 or 6 feet and upwards. interesting, and still below that, nothing but rocks of lava. It is in these spots that the trees arrive at such an immense size. It brings to mind the buried 6 feet under kind of thing, and all the cemeteries they use that 6 foot kind of thing. Interesting. It is in these spots that the trees arrive at such an immense size. Their roots shoot into the crevices of the lava and lay such hold of it that there is no instance of the winds tearing them up, though there are many of its breaking off their larger branches. A branch of one of the great chestnut trees where we passed yesterday has fallen across a deep gully and formed a very commodious bridge over the rivulet below. The people say it was done by Saint Agatha, the guardian saint of the mountain, who has the superintendence of all its operations. In the lowest part of the first region of Etna, the harvest is almost over, but in the upper parts of the same region, near the confines of the Regione Silvosa, it will not begin for several weeks. The reapers, as we went along, abused us from all quarters, and more excellent blackguards I have never met with, but indeed our guides were a full match for them. They began as soon as we were within hearing, and did not finish till we were got quite without reach of their voices, which they extend as much as they could. As it was all in Sicilian, we could make very little of it, but by the interpretation of our guides, however, we could not help admiring the volubility and natural elocution with which they spoke. This custom is as old as the time of the Romans, and probably much older, as it is mentioned by Horace and others of their authors. It is still in vogue here as much as ever. The masters encourage it. They think it gives them spirits and makes the work go on more cheerfully. And I believe they are right, for it is amazing what pleasure they seem to take in it, and what laughing and merriment it occasioned. I forgot to mention that we passed the source of the famous cold river, Il Fiume Freddo. This is the river so celebrated by the poets in the fable of Acis and Galatea. It was here that Acis was supposed to have been killed by Polyphemus, and the gods out of compassion converted him into this river, which is still, retaining the terror inspired by the dreadful voice of the Cyclops, runs with great rapidity, and about a mile from its source throws itself into the sea. It rises at once out of the earth, a large stream. Its water is remarkably pure and so extremely cold that it is reckoned dangerous to drink it. But I am told that it has likewise a poisonous quality, which proceeds from its being impregnated with vitriol, to such a degree that cattle have often been killed by it. It never freezes, but what is remarkable, it is said often to contract a degree of cold greater than that of ice. I also find it so interesting that the waters, the springs, every one of them you hear in the ancient times had a different purpose, had a different mineral, had a different healing property or weird poison property, everything, energetic property. Every one of them seemed to be different and unique. It's astounding. Now they're all poison. These particulars I was informed of by the priests of Assi, which place anciently called Assi Aquileia, and several others near it, Assi Castello, Assi Terra, etc., take their names from the unfortunate shepherd Acis. A little to the east of the river Acis, A-C-I-S, whatever, is the mouth of the river Alcantara, one of the most considerable in the island. It takes its rise on the north side of Mount Etna and marks out the boundary of the mountain for about 60 miles. Its course has been stopped in many places by the eruptions of the volcano, so that strictly speaking, the skirts of Etna extend much beyond it, though it has generally been considered as the boundary. We passed it on our way to Piedmont over a large bridge built entirely of lava, and near to this the bed of the river is continued for a great way, through one of the most remarkable and probably one of the most ancient lavas that ever run from Etna. In many places the current of the river, which is extremely rapid, has worn down the solid lava to depth of 50 or 60 feet. Recupero, the gentleman I have mentioned, who is engaged in writing the natural history of Etna, tells me he has examined this lava with great attention, and he thinks that its course, including all its windings, is not less than 40 miles. It issued from a mountain on the north side of Etna, and finding some valleys that lay to the east, it took its course all that way, interrupting the Alcantara in many places, and at last arrived at the sea, not far from the mouth of that river. The city of Jassy or Assi, and indeed all the towns on this coast, are founded on immense rocks of lava, heaped one above another, in some places to an amazing height, for it appears that these flaming torrents, as soon as they arrived at the sea, were hardened into rock, which, not yielding any longer to the pressure of the liquid fire behind, the melted matter continuing to accumulate, formed a dam of fire, which in a short time run over the solid front, pouring a second torrent into the ocean. This was immediately consolidated and succeeded by a third, and so on. Many of the places on this coast still retain their ancient names, but the properties ascribed to them by the ancients are now no more. The river Acis, which is now so poisonous, was old celebrated for the sweetness and salubrity of its waters, which Theocritus says were ever held sacred by the Sicilian shepherds. We were surprised to find that so many places retain the name of this swain, who, I imagined, had never existed, but in the imagination of the poets. But the Sicilian authors say that Acis was the name of a king who reigned in this part of the island in the time of the most remote antiquity, in confirmation of which Massa gives the translation of an inscription found near Assi Castello. He is said to have been slain in a fit of jealousy by Polyphemus, one of the giants of Etna, which gave rise to the fable. Anguillara, a Sicilian poet, in relating this story, gives a tremendous idea of the voice of Polyphemus. The passage has been greatly admired. So that may be something to dive a little further into, but that's all they give us in this little clip here. But everything, giants. I am starting to believe that these things are terraforming, that volcanoes, just different ways of creating. They work in rings. You know, if I was an underground technology trying to build out, this is exactly what I would do. Something like that, just if I had ultimate power and this world was small. If you were a giant, this world would be a lot smaller than we see it. Our perspective is shifted, and they know how to do it. Same with the giant trees, the everything. There are so many different things, and this is a good preparation for a talk that I've got coming up in a soon video with my buddy in Aruba, where we talk about the tunnels and the potential that that place has for ancient mastery during the time, again, when all this magic stuff, I think, has been wiped out for a substantial amount of time. But there is a time in our past when these things, all these places were built. Everything was in their primes, the tunnels, everything was working. Everything was the way it is and up to the present. Whether these volcanoes are purely natural or an ancient technology, or it's still happening, modern technology from another realm, another bit of life form that occurs here, very intelligent, somewhere doing something for some purpose that we don't know. I have no idea. I like to keep all possibilities out there and see what happens and just keep it building, and then maybe come up with some cool art to describe it. So stay tuned. There will be more to come. In the next video will be cool. It will all relate. Everything relates. Everything's connected. We're just piecing it together, whatever we can, whatever's left, and hopefully we can discover more all together as a community of awesome people in search of truth of our origins, which we know are incredible. Bless you all.